If you're about to start or have already started maternity leave, you may be wondering what rights you have to return to your prior role at the end of your leave. Hi, I'm Mike from Cash and Legal, and in this video, I'm going to discuss your right to return to your prior role at the end of your maternity leave. At the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of your right to return to your previous role at the end of your leave and what remedies you may have available if that right is not afforded to you. Let's start with the context. To understand your right to maternity leave in Alberta, it is helpful to be familiar with the legislation that establishes those rights. In Alberta, there are two important pieces of legislation affecting your right to take maternity leave, specifically the Employment Standards Code and the Alberta Human Rights Act. The Employment Standards Code is a piece of legislation that sets out a variety of basic obligations that employers owe to their employees. These basic obligations including the rules and framework for providing maternity leaves. The code establishes your right to take maternity leave and sets out the framework that your employer must adhere to when administering your maternity leave. The other important piece of legislation is the Alberta Human Rights Act. This legislation establishes that employers cannot discriminate against their employee based on protected grounds, including gender and family status. The result of these protections is that an employer cannot discriminate against you on the basis of a maternity leave. Familiarity with these two pieces of legislation is important for understanding how your maternity leave rights work in Alberta and what right you have to return to your previous role at the end of your leave. Let's review some of the basic obligations that your employer has to you under the Employment Standards Code. If you've worked with your employer for more than 90 days, they are required to provide you with the benefit of maternity leave. Further, under the Employment Standards Code, your employer cannot terminate your employment during your maternity leave. There is a limited exception to this rule that permits your employer to terminate your employment during maternity leave if they shut down all or part of the business. However, provided that this limited exception does not apply, your employer is not permitted to terminate your employment during a maternity leave. The code also establishes that once your maternity leave is over, your employer is required to reinstate you to your same position or a comparable role at the same level or greater earnings. So if you provide your employer with sufficient notice of your intention to return from mat leave, which is 4 weeks in Alberta, your employer is required to reinstate you to that same role or a comparable role. However, there is one major caveat that you should be aware of relating to this right to reinstatement. Although your employer is required to reinstate you at the end of your leave, your employer is permitted to terminate your employment upon your return. Put another way, your employer is not required to employ you for any period of time following your return. This means that your employer can legally terminate your employment on the day that you return from maternity leave. If your employer does terminate your employment on the day that you return from maternity leave, you are still entitled to all the other rights that any other employee would have on termination, including accumulated vacation pay and termination pay. However, you would find yourself without a job in a very difficult set of circumstances. If you find yourself in this situation, just because you don't have any protections under the Employment Standards Code, you may still have some remedies available under the Human Rights Act. While the code simply prohibits an employer from terminating employment during maternity leave, the Human Rights Act goes further than that and prohibits employers from terminating employment for any reasons related to a maternity leave. Termination in these circumstances is not necessarily discriminatory, but there are certain factors we can identify which suggest it may be. For example, if your employer complained about your decision to take mat leave or about the impact of your mat leave, this suggests that your mat leave was a factor in the decision to terminate your employment. Another common factor that we look for in these circumstances is whether your mat leave replacement has continued employment beyond the date of your termination. If your employer lets you go but keeps your mat leave replacement, this also suggests that the decision to terminate your employment was related to your maternity leave. Finally, going back to the Employment Standards Code, as I mentioned earlier, your employer can satisfy its obligation to reinstate you by providing you with not the same role, but a comparable role. This begs the question, what is a comparable role? There are some roles which are slightly different from your prior role, which may be comparable and therefore satisfy your employer's obligation to reinstate you. Whether or not a role is comparable or not is a fact-dependent analysis, and every case is going to be different. However, one of the general overriding factors we look at is whether the new role is lesser than the previous role and whether the objective reasonable person would consider the new role a demotion. If it is clear that the rule is a demotion, this suggests that your employer has not reinstated you to a comparable and has therefore breached its obligations under the code. Similarly, if your employer has offered you a new role or the same role at lesser compensation, that is a clear breach of the code. In addition to being a breach of the code, imposing a new role at the end of a mat leave may also amount to a constructive dismissal. If you want to learn more about constructive dismissal, click the link to the constructive dismissal blog post in the description of this video. The bottom line is that your employer's obligation to reinstate you to your previous role is not absolute. Your employer can reinstate you to a different role, or they can terminate your employment immediately following reinstatement. However, if your employer does attempt to terminate your employment or change your role, this likely warrants a review by legal counsel. Regardless of where you are in your mat leave process, if you're worried about whether your employer will reinstate you upon your return, we can assist you with this. We provide employees with support related to their mat leave by providing clarity about their circumstances, strategies for managing discussions with their employers, and peace of mind through sound advice and strong representation. If you're looking for assistance with respect to your mat leave, do not hesitate to click the link to our website in the description of this video and book a consultation with our office.